Probably on track. Hi. Hi.
We're going to go ahead and get started, and we're going to continue talking today about auditory processing disorder. And recall from last time we mentioned that auditory processing, the definition I can give you is what the brain does with what the ear hears. So, making sense of what it is that we hear. There are some that will say that an auditory processing disorder is a specific form of sensory processing disorder or sensory integration disorder. I wouldn't argue with that. sensory integration is just the ability to make sense of sensory input. There are kids that have sensory integration problems with tactile information. There are kids that have sensory integration issues with vestibular information, with visual information. So I really don't think that making sense of auditory information is all that different. And so if it's comfortable or easy for you to think of auditory processing disorder as a form of sensory integration deficit, feel free. One of the things that we talked about is that there is still some controversy surrounding auditory processing disorder. Some people buy into it, some people don't, some people think that it's a language deficit. I explained to you that I disagree with that. I do think it is a real entity, not the least of which is that when we look at the ICD-9 codes, which are the diagnostic codes, there are actually diagnosis codes for auditory processing disorders. So I don't think the AMA would assign one or more codes to a condition that doesn't exist. So that's probably the quickest argument against that. Some people you will hear them refer to it as APD, auditory processing disorder. Some people refer to it as CAPD, or central auditory processing disorder. Some people, you'll see them abbreviated as C in parentheses, APD. I don't really care which one you use. I personally prefer auditory processing disorder because I do believe that some folks who have auditory processing issues, the root of the problem is not in the central nervous system, but in the peripheral system. Can be the pathways leading from ear to the brain, not necessarily in the auditory association areas of the brain. So, but I'm not going to get hung up on that. If you want to call it CAPD, you're welcome to do that. I just think that makes it a little bit too narrow of a focus, because I do think that the peripheral can and does play a dramatic impact. When we talk about auditory processing disorder, we really should probably refer to it in the plural as auditory processing disorders, because it can take a number of different forms. There are 4 primary classifications that most audiologists will talk about. There's a 5th, which would be some combination of 2 or more of these. Just like there's so many things that we deal with, not everything is completely cut and dry. But probably the most common form that I see in folks that are referred to me is the decoding deficit. And that is where they typically have problems with understanding speech, so discrimination, particularly in noise, so that auditory figure ground issue is prominent. Other things that you'll see is sometimes a relative unawareness of the fact that they've misunderstood or misheard something. Not always the most self-aware when they have a decoding issue. This is the type of problem where we tend to see a lot of reading and spelling issues going on. You might also see that the child or adult might be described as doing really well with math unless there's word problems, in which case they then seem to struggle more. So basically what happens is that they're having a problem with decoding or making sense of the information that's coming in, particularly related to speech. So they ask for frequent repetition, ask or what a lot. They just don't seem to be getting it. When we were talking about intervention, general terms for oral rehab. We talked about a top-down versus a bottom-up type of approach. Which type of an approach do you think might be most appropriate for a decoding issue?
Say the top down, you're trying to like go ahead and
Okay, and there's a school of thought that says that. It's a trick question, so thank you. It really depends on the individual. Their main problem is that they're having trouble decoding the information that's coming in. So there's an argument that could be made that, okay, well, that's the reality, so let's modify and change the environment, let's work on comprehension. But there's also an argument that can be made that we take more of a bottom-up approach and that we try and remediate some of those skills and that we intervene trying to maximize the signal. Because particularly if their major problem is with auditory figure ground and the ability to understand in noise, we can improve the signal-to-noise ratio, we may take care of the problem. So, again, you have to look at the whole situation. Thank you for being brave to answer when it was kind of a trick question. You have to look at what's the biggest struggle for them. And if they're having problems decoding whether or not there's noise or not, then probably a top-down approach is going to be your best option. But if their biggest problem seems to be that auditory figure ground, that ability to understand in noise, then sometimes improving that signal-to-noise ratio will take care of the problem. And so that's more of a bottom-up approach. Probably the second most common type that I have seen is that we have an association deficit, and that is where they're showing a lot of problems with phonemic and phonological awareness. They're showing some receptive language deficits. They often don't get humor, sarcasm. They have problems with drawing conclusions or making inferences. Will have a terrible time, typically, with acquiring a second language, unless what? That can help, but what particular skill, or what particular feature of that second language may make it easier for them? If they have problems with phonemic and phonological awareness. And what is one of my repeated comments, negative comments about English? What were you going to say? Okay, sign language could, if it's very visual, absolutely, that would be. But let's talk about verbal languages.
It has like better sound to letter correspondence?
Yes, if it's more of a phonetic language. So, if you have a child who's struggling in English, he or she may actually not have as much of a problem with a language like Spanish, which is much more phonetic, because they can much more reliably predict what sound a letter is making, because there are very few deviations. It's typically one letter, one sound. The really cool thing about the Spanish alphabet has more letters, or at least more orthographs. Okay, so we have A, B, C. That's a letter. Okay, and then we have the N, and then we have the N with the tilde. That's a different sound. So do you see what I'm getting at? Kids will learn, oh, when I see this, that's a yeah versus no. Okay? This is s or k, depending on which vowel comes after it. So it's an easy rule. But this is ch, okay? So they learn very easily to make predictions. So it's not universally true that they will have problems with the second language if that second language is more phonetic or more phonemically balanced, is another term that you'll hear used, than their native language. They may not have as much of a problem. So these are the ones where they're going to have issues with letter sound, recognition, phonological awareness, drawing conclusions, making inferences, things like that. They tend to be very concrete. That's probably, if I had to come up with a single word to describe an individual with an association deficit, this is they're very concrete in their thinking. Next, we have integration deficit. These are kids where the ears are not necessarily working well together. And so we usually see a sustained, up until about the age of 7 or 8, it's not at all unusual if you do testing of auditory integration or auditory separation, where we're either trying to get them to tell us everything that they hear when there's maybe competing messages to both ears, or only tell us what they hear in one ear when there's competing messages. An ear advantage, particularly a right ear advantage, is not all that unusual in the younger kids. But once they get to be particularly under the age of 8, by the time they get to be 10, we really should see a not noticeably strong ear advantage anymore. And if we do, that's a very big red flag that the ears are not going to be working together well. And if the ears are not working together well, we tend to see some very specific problems. They have issues with phonics, obviously. These kids often have, in addition to auditory issues, they often have visual perceptual issues. You may hear mom or dad or grandma or whomever mention that they have trouble with visual spatial concepts. They will often have, when we do our testing, and I talked about some of the different specialty tests, these kids have a real problem with pattern recognition, so they will have problems with temporal processing. These kids have trouble with rhymes. They can't necessarily tell you accurately if 2 words rhyme, or even if they can tell you if 2 words rhyme, if you give them a word, they're going to have a really difficult time coming up with a word that rhymes with it. So they have a real problem with that temporal processing. These kids, as a result of some of these other issues, sound blending and segmenting is difficult for them. What's an example of a sound blending task? What did we talk? Yes.
Like if I give you the sounds at what word they make.
Right. So you can blend them together. Sort of sounding it out. Can they sound out words? Can they take the individual sounds and tell you what it is? Okay? Segmenting is when you do just the opposite. So they're given a word and they have to then break it down into its component sounds. So if I gave you the word top, can you segment it? What are the sounds in the word top? Okay? These are kids that when we do phonemic and phonological awareness testing, one of the tasks on one of the tests I really like, the auditory processing abilities test, the APAC, there's a task where you give them a word, it it may be a nonsense word or a regular real word, and you ask them, for example, I'm trying to think of one of the words that are on there. So let's say the word is chop. And you say to them, what's the first sound? What's the first sound in the word chop? And what do they say? Not ch. C. Okay, because they're having a hard time separating the letters and the sounds. Or you might say to them, what's the last sound in the word gum? And they'll say M. So that's what we mean when we say that they have problems with sound blending and segmentation. These kids have a real problem with distractions, and it doesn't necessarily have to be only auditory. Remember, these kids have a proclivity towards visual issues as well. So your kids with an integration deficit are the ones that are going to probably most closely mimic kids with ADD or ADHD. Okay? Because they're going to have that second, they're more likely to have a second sensory modality issue, and that's visual. Okay? Real problems with that. Probably the one that I see the least, and when I do see it, I tend to see it more with adolescents and adults, is the output organizational deficit. A lot of times kids will go for years with a problem that would be classified as one or the other of the previous three, but over time they've developed some coping skills and some strategies to help them get by. That was me. And they then end up in a place where they really are struggling with some very specific things. They may have note-taking issues. They try and write down every single word. Every single word. I see some giggles in here. Oftentimes, they will have problems with sequencing. So they may be able to list all of the steps if you were to ask them to tell me the steps involved in making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. They might be able to tell you all the steps involved, but they may get them out of sequence. And, oh, well, wait, before you do that, you've got to, or they'll say, okay, well, you put some peanut butter on a piece of bread, and then you put some jelly on it, and then you put the other piece of bread. Well, they forgot to tell you first, you have to get the bread, you have to get the peanut butter, you have to get the jelly, you need to get a knife, and then you're going to stick the knife into the peanut butter, spread the peanut butter on one piece of bread, then you're going to get the jelly and spread the jelly on the other piece of bread, and then you're going to slap the two pieces together. So they may leave out steps where they may get them out of sequence. Another thing that I often will see is short-term memory issues, and that's why they try and, when they're taking notes, they try and write down everything. And as a result, they often have problems with recall of facts. They'll often, if you give them a list of things to remember, they will often have a tendency to remember the first and last member of the list, but they have difficulty with the stuff in between. So they tend to have more, for lack of a better word, functional language consequences than some of the other forms. The other ones, if there's language issues, they tend to be more foundational, more basic, whereas with these folks, it's really more practical, functional things, and so we have to work on additional strategies to help them with that. Okay, and we're going to talk about a specific method that's very useful for compensating for a deficit in output organizational. Typically, when we talk about remediation, whether we're taking a bottom-up or a top-down approach, we're going to be looking at 4 basic parameters. We're going to be looking at environmental factors. We're going to be looking at compensation, remediation, and what else? What else do we want to look at? Assistive devices. We want to give them increased access. And so when you have depending on which type of disorder that you feel the person has, you may be spending more time with one particular type of those interventions than the other. Typically, with output and organizational issues, you're going to really be concentrating on compensation. You're going to be working on strategies that are going to help them cope with and get around their problem. As opposed to a decoding deficit, where we're really going to be trying to either remediate the issue or provide them with assistive devices to improve their access. Does that make sense? Okay. With association and integration, we typically have to look at all 4 fairly equally. So decoding, we're probably going to spend more time with assistive devices, and we're probably going to be spending more time with remediation, because those are some skills that we can actually try and improve. Output organizational, we're going to look at compensation, and with association and integration, we're looking at really a fairly equal combination of all. So when I say that when we're talking about treatment considerations, we have to consider the environment where we may issue. We may want to modify the environment. What am I talking about? What do you envision?
One of the issues you were talking about with your strategies is the echoing, so it would be like carpeting a room or something.
Right. If you can use carpeting, maybe cork boards, bulletin boards, things that are soundproofing, acoustical tiles. One of the things that has had one of the most dramatic impacts on improving the environment is putting tennis balls, the hole cutting them, on the bottoms of the chairs, of the desks. So they move smoothly without making a sound. My wife being an OT, they use tennis balls on the feet of rolling walkers as well, because it helps them move smoothly. And so needless to say, our swim club that we belong to is also a tennis and racket club. And so once a month, they have a big bag of used, no longer usable for tennis and racquetball balls for us that we take to her work, and they replace the tennis balls on all the rolling walkers, because it's handy and it's great for them, because they get a tax write-off and can say they donated it, and our patients love it because then the family doesn't have to pay to go to Walmart and buy a can of tennis balls. So, but environmental modifications, it could be something though. Let's say, for example, you've got a classroom that is right by an entrance, like we are here, and that there's a lot of foot traffic along the corridor, and maybe it's got windows facing outside to traffic. That's probably not a room where you want to have a hearing impaired classroom. I've seen it. It's probably not a classroom that you want to use for a self-contained or pull-out special ed classroom. So it may be that you have to relocate It may actually involve literally reallocating or relocating to a different space. So it's anything that you're doing to modify or manipulate the environment to make it more listening friendly. Assistive devices, we're going to talk about assistive devices. Specifically, we're probably looking at FM or infrared listening systems. Compensatory strategies, those would be things that we do to help them get around with or to cope with their deficits. And then finally, remediation would be what? What's the focus of remediation? For my grad students who are in here, there are people who in 629, if they don't do well on a particular learning module, they have to do a remediation. Not that any of you sitting here have got to do that. I would say, as far as I can remember, none of you did. But ladies, what is it, a remediation?
When you have to relearn something and do it again.
Yeah, so we work on teaching them new skills in order to improve their ability to listen or process. Thank you. I don't mean to pick on you, but I know I can with the three of you because you're good sports. Plus you know where my office is, so I have to but I don't go to. Okay, so again, some examples of environmental modifications are those acoustical tiles, using carpets, soundproofing, relocation, insulation, anything that you can do to make it a more listening-friendly environment. Assistive devices. This is when we're going to be looking at making sure if the children have any hearing issues, that those are addressed. And if they don't, and frequently they won't have a hearing loss, we will look at using personal or sound field FM systems. Does FM stand for? Frequency modulation. So we are looking at ways to maximize their access to sound. Personal units are ones like we see these kiddos wearing, where they actually have a device that's on their ear. But there are sound field systems, and you'll see an illustration of one coming up in a minute. The advantage to personal FM, I personally like personal FM over sound field FM from the standpoint that every kid is going to be slightly different in terms of what he or she needs. And so if they have their own personal FM system, it can be custom set to their individual needs. So I may have a kid with an auditory processing disorder that as long as I can get them to like a +8 or a +10 signal to noise ratio, they actually do fine. But I may have another kid that I need to get them to a +15 signal to noise ratio. And keep in mind, about every 3 decibels of difference is a doubling of perception. So if I have a kid who can get by with +8, and I have another kid that I need to get to +15, I'm doubling that 3 times over. So that perceptually, it's going to sound 6 times louder to you if you're listening to one versus the other. That's a huge difference. Think about if you're sitting around watching TV, and there's someone who is a volume junkie, and man, it's not that they have a hearing problem, but boy, they like that sound cranked up. And then invariably they're sitting with someone who's like, that's way too loud. So personal FM is customizable, and it can go with the kid everywhere. They can actually take it with them from class to class. Whereas with the sound field system, it's there in the room or it's not. And there are a lot of schools that maybe have certain rooms are sound field wired and others are not. And so if you have a kid with an auditory processing problem and maybe only one of his classes is wired for Soundfield FM, what's he supposed to do in the rest of those classes? He's going to struggle. So I like it because personal FM is portable. It goes with the individual. What happens is the teacher is going to have a microphone, usually worn on a lanyard, maybe a lapel mic, and it has a transmitter that takes their voice and sends out an FM signal. The kid has a receiver on or in their ear that is set to the same channel, to the same frequency, and allows them to pick up that signal, which then goes directly in their ear. So the result is that it's like that teacher has come up and is talking to them right in their ear, so that you're avoiding distance, background noise, and reverberation. 3 things that can be critically impactful. Yes?
Is it hard to like get insurance to pay for an FM system, or do schools do it, or how does someone get an FM system?
Short answer is yes, it's difficult, but it's becoming easier. The schools are really becoming much more aware, because people like me are preaching it and shoving the evidence in their face, that this is a quick and easy way to improve the child's educational experience. And guess what? You have an initial outlay for the equipment, but guess what? They often then improve their academic experience, and they no longer need special services, which are really expensive. So there's a really cool report that I have that has a cost-benefit analysis looking at personal and Soundfield FM and what the cost is versus what the long-term costs are for special services for the kid. And when you start breaking it down into, if you put in Soundfield in all of your classrooms, it has an average cost of 19 cents per kid. They're usually, over the life of the system, they're usually really receptive to that, because there's not a whole lot of equipment or materials that can be supplied that are going to cost you an average of 19 cents per kid over the life of those materials. It's usually significantly higher. So they learn that it's a bargain. Some insurance companies have gotten much better about paying for it. We typically have to watch how we code it, and typically if we code it as central hearing loss, and as long as I have some indications that it's not just the peripheral system, but that it is the central system, I'm okay with using that code. They're more likely to pay than if I just call it an auditory processing disorder or a central auditory processing disorder. But that's not universally the case. Sometimes parents have to pay for it out of pocket if they really want it. Sometimes insurance will pay for a really basic unit that has like a headband, earphone, or earbud, and the unit is much bigger. It looks like the unit would be bigger, about this big, but a lot thicker, probably about that thick, which some kids don't like, whereas with the really nice ones, they have a really tiny, remember those mini BTEs that we looked at? They look, they're tiny, no one's even going to necessarily know the kids use it. Not that that's the most important aspect, but especially when they get to be adolescents, that appearance factor can be very important. So personal, I think, is best because we can customize it. It's typically very portable, and you can have multiple kids using personal FM in the same classroom, and they just need to be tuned to the same signal. And if they move to another classroom, then, especially if it's right next door, you're probably going to want to switch the signal, the channel, so that you're not getting cross feedback, because they may be picking up, the teacher in this room is set to one channel. You don't want the teacher right next door set to that same channel, or they're going to start getting interference from each other. You also need to make sure to instruct the teachers that, oh, by the way, make sure you turn off your microphone whenever you're saying or doing something that you don't want everyone to hear. Because I've had teachers who will wear it into the bathroom and forget that. And so all of the bathroom sounds and everything that they're doing is then broadcast to the kids who are tuned to that channel in the vicinity. I've had them go into a meeting, and everything that's going on in that meeting, sometimes things that kids really don't need to be hearing, especially if it's about a classmate, it's broadcasted. So you have to make sure that you do some education with the teachers to make sure that they get into the habit of turning it off when it's for someone else's ears. Soundfield FM works exactly the same way as far as the microphone and the transmitter, but the receivers are actually set into speakers that can be embedded in the ceiling or placed around the room. And so then that sound kind of bathes the classroom. Ohio was the first state to require that any new school construction or any significant renovation projects of a school must include Soundfield FM in every classroom. And so it was really cool because the law took effect right about the time that Cincinnati Public Schools was undertaking a 10-year master plan of either replacing or renovating every single school in the district. And my son's principal at his school was so excited to have me when they were having an open house when the renovation was about halfway finished. Invited everyone to come in and, let's revisit our old school that's going to be new again. And she was so excited to point out to me that, see, we have FM in every classroom. And the reason why that's a big deal is because Ohio's results were instrumental in helping get out some of the evidence. Because guess what happened when they started looking at what was happening in those schools where Soundfield FM was in use over a period of time? A couple things happened. What do you think happened?
That all the students were doing better, even like normal students.
Everybody did better. Test scores went up. Guess what else happened? Fewer call-offs for vocal fatigue by the teachers because they weren't having to raise their voice as much. Guess what else happened? Test scores went up. Students were performing better. Guess what went down? Utilization of special services. So it was one of those things where it was dramatic and really easy to see the impact that it had. And so now more and more states are coming on board and passing similar legislation. Those of you who have had me for multiple classes know I'm all about government staying out of our business as much as possible. Because time and again we see examples of how the government got involved in running something and they screwed it up. how many years have we had the US Postal Service? 200 and some odd, and they still can't get it right because they don't allow it to run like a regular business. Social Security, Medicare, you name it. They're not good at running businesses. But there are some things that I do think they do a decent job with. And I think that, at least at the state level, Ohio did the right thing by requiring. Now more and more states are following along doing the same. Taylor, did you have a question? I didn't mean to ignore
Oh,
you. but
no, I was just gonna ask about the personal FM, if it's only for those channels at the school, but like they're not listening to outside or anything.
Right, yeah, no, it's gonna only be tuned, it's only gonna pick up what's tuned to that particular FM signal. So it's not a Bluetooth signal, anything, it's truly an FM signal, and it's only gonna pick up whatever's being broadcast on that, and there's a special segment of the FM spectrum, and it's really low. You know, like, if you tune your radio, you know, things are like 88 to like 108. Well, these are things that are like down in the okay.
Are schools required to, or like are teachers required to have like training for the FM systems? Like it's just
If the school is using it, they have to have training.
because like my cousin has a hearing loss, and I mean I think this was last year. I don't know if it's still like this year too, but I mean he's in 8th grade, so he's not going to make a big stink if the FM system doesn't work, because he's going to be embarrassed by it. The teacher didn't know how to work it. Now he's so smart, so I think he did fine. But like, what's the point of having it for something?
If he has an IEP or a 504 plan that says that it's to be used, then technically the school has a responsibility to make sure that all of his teachers know how to use it. And if you're aware that that's not happening, I plant a bug in his parents' ears that you need to raise a stink about this, because he's not gonna, and he's missing out.
Does every child with a hearing aid have an IEP? Like,
If they have a hearing loss and they are using assistive technology, I can't imagine a situation where they wouldn't have an IEP. But it may be that their assistive devices are doing such a good job of overcoming the educational impact that now, even though they have a documented impairment, if their assistive devices are eliminating that educational impact, because remember we have to have that educational impact piece as well, then they may no longer qualify for an IEP, but you still want to make sure that you're getting a 504 plan that says that that device needs to be used and people need to know in order to make sure that he continues to get the accommodation. Because it may be that he doesn't need specialized instruction, he doesn't need any adjustment in the curriculum or anything, as long as that device is being used. And that's what often happens with kids that have a hearing loss or that have an auditory processing disorder. If we get them into the right assistive technology, there's no longer an educational impact. So then they get transitioned out of special services, but I always tell parents, when they have that ARC meeting where they're looking at their annual review and they're deciding, okay, they're going to train, you need to make sure that a 504 gets put into place to make sure, especially if it's that device is what's keeping them performing at grade level, that that device is used and that everyone can do it. Okay? So the difference is, how is the kid accessing the sound from that teacher's FM transmitter? Are they the only ones getting it because they have a personal unit, or is everyone getting it because it's sound field? You have to be very careful with sound field, and I'll show you a really good illustration. But this is an example of the FM system that I like. Transitioned from these are the ear level units to now they're using this ear level unit. but there's still a lot of those out there. And what happens is that the teacher has this component here, and you can set which channel you're going to be using, and you can set the channel on the device so you can adjust it, and then the teacher wears this microphone and they can actually increase the volume, decrease the volume, or switch the channel.
The microphone is like on their shirt or whatever. If they like turn to the side and talk, does it still pick it up pretty well?
It does still, it's still going to pick up their voice more than anything else. You may see a reduction in the overall loudness just as they turn away, but it's still going to keep their voice significantly higher. If the student has some hearing loss, maybe some minimal hearing loss or any degree of hearing loss, and uses hearing aids, there's actually this little tiny boot that can be put on the end of their hearing aid that is actually the FM receiver, and so it will then pick up that signal and put it into the hearing aid so that the kid is still getting that FM signal nice and clear, delivered right to the ear. And FM is used a lot, not just for auditory processing, but for hearing loss as well. It was originally designed for hearing loss, then it was adapted and modified to be used for folks that don't have a hearing loss but have processing issues. This is one of the other, this is one of the cheaper models. So again, this is what the teacher has. These little controls allow them to adjust which channel they're on, which FM channel that they're on. It has the corded leveler microphone, and then the kid has this unit, which is then connected to a standard set of earphones. So, if you're a kid, what are you going to rather have? This box with a headband, or something like this that no one's going to see? I can guarantee you. The difference in price, something like this is usually going to run you a couple of $100. Something like these, probably more in the range of about $1,500 to $1,700. So there is a significant difference in price. But the sound quality is better, it's more cosmetically appealing, and it's more flexible. Because on this one, you could actually, in the same classroom, you can pair. So let's say I have 3 kids, 5 kids in my classroom. I can actually pair it to their individual personal devices, and I can even put them on different channels if I wanted to. And I might want to do that so that if I'm giving specific instruction to one kid, I can make sure I'm only on one of the channels rather than all of them, and so the other kids aren't going to be hearing.
Did you say that the teacher can turn the volume up and down and change the channel?
They can change that as well. There is this plus and minus here. That's the volume. This up and down is the channel changer. There's other programs like this one. I think it says like Johnny Jones or Jenny Jones, and that's the channel that kid's on. But if I wanted to pair several different kids, I don't have to. I can broadcast it all on one signal, and it'll go to all of them. But if I wanted to specifically pair it so that it will only go to kids who are paired, so that if I have a kid in the next room, but I don't have them paired to my device, they're not going to pick it up, so I don't have to worry about that interference. So again, this type of setup is more expensive, but it allows us to do a lot more customization. And I can set it so that, okay, so Johnny Jones is on channel H33, and I need to give him, knowing my voice, I need to give him X volume control, the X volume setting. but someone else doesn't need the same volume, so if I pair it, even if I keep them on the same channel, I can set it so that they're only getting a different amount of boost. That's great, because then I don't have to worry if I raise and lower my voice, they're all going to be getting what they need. With this system, if I've got 6 kids in my room that are using this system, I'm going to have 6 of those puppies because it's only paired to that one. So I don't think I want to walk around with 6 microphones strapped to my shirt. They're working on changing that technology so that you can set them now with Bluetooth. So these were made before we had Bluetooth. So now they're trying to make them wirelessly communicate with each other so that all of them in the room will. But it doesn't always work that way. Some of them do, some of them don't. And the ones that do have that capability where you can use one with multiple, they are at the higher end. Even though they're significantly cheaper, they're at the higher end. The cheaper the unit, the more basic it is, and probably less user-friendly and functional it's going to be. Okay? So, what happens is you have this FM system, and you can have speakers set up around the room, or you can have, so these are some of the different, or you can have them embedded in the ceiling, and so it creates these listening circles throughout the room. The problem is you're going to have some kids who are not necessarily totally surrounded by the sound. They're going to be on the periphery, so they're going to do better. They're going to get a better signal-to-noise ratio than if there wasn't any, but they're not necessarily going to get the full benefit. And so what can happen is, depending on where you put those speakers, like here, the way that those speakers are trained, everyone's getting fairly equal. We just have this one dead zone kind of here in the middle. So these 2 kids right here are probably not getting quite as much of a signal as their classmates. Whereas if you just have a single one, you can see it's darker here, so the signal is loudest and strongest right here, and it gets weaker and weaker as we travel to the back, so that these kids are really not getting the benefit. These kids are not getting any benefit either because the speaker's not directing at them. So that's the major drawback with Soundfield FM, is that you don't necessarily get uniform distribution of the sound signal. So if I were to ask you on an exam to describe the differences between personal and Soundfield FM, what are some of the similarities and what are some of the differences? Those are some of the things. The particular drawback to Soundfield is that you don't necessarily get equal distribution of the sound to everybody. So you will actually end up with some dead zones in the classroom, and you want to make sure that you don't have anyone sitting in those dead zones.
So is the only drawback to the personal one is that you have to put it on actually?
That's the biggest draw, at the expense and that you're actually wearing something as the user. Obviously with both of them, the teacher's wearing something because they have the transmitter. Does that make sense? And is it helpful? That picture's really crappy on there, I'm sorry. Because on my screen, you can really see that it's darker here and it gets lighter. You really can't hardly see that yellowish color at all. Well, you can kind of see how it's more grayed out. Here, they're all kind of uniformly gray, except for these 2 right here. Whereas here, you can see it's the darkest right in this area, none over there, and then it's weaker back here. But, anyway, if you look at it on your computer, definitely. So, when we are talking about intervention for auditory processing disorders, there are some classroom accommodations that we can make. These are based on that Florida matrix that I've talked about. Florida was the first state to come out with a very comprehensive school-based intervention plan for auditory processing, and it's been kind of modified and adopted. You can make modifications in your curriculum so you actually change the way that information is presented. Probably the biggest is rate. You want to tend to slow down your speaking rate slightly, not so much so that it's abnormal, but typically when you slow down, you pause frequently, and you emphasize specific words, learning improves. So working with the teachers to do that. You want to make sure that you gain their attention before speaking. So it may be that you need to approach a particular student and, get into their line of sight, or you may need to, okay everyone, you do something to gain their attention so that they know, okay, I need to listen. Using visual aids can be helpful unless they have what type of an auditory processing deficit. Which one has?
Integration.
Yes, if they have an integration issue, they may not benefit. It's not that it's going to necessarily make it worse, but they may not benefit as much from that augmented visual supplementation. Use of RELIA. That's a SPA 223 word. Who remembers what RELIA is? Say it out loud. Real objects, yes. Anytime that you can use real objects. I love seeing this works because there are several people who knew that answer. They remembered that answer and were afraid to say it out loud for fear of being wrong. Don't ever be afraid to be wrong in this class. I promise I won't make fun of you and I'll shoot at anyone who laughs at you. Okay, so curriculum modifications are one type of modification. Another thing that we can do in the classroom is to compensate. We teach children compensation strategies, so we always train them to look and listen. Remind them. Use a visual daily calendar. For those of you who have had 427, what's a visual calendar or a visual schedule?
It's a binder of activities like getting dressed in the morning or going to lunch or classroom activities.
Right. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a binder. It could be, it's a series of pictures and it shows the sequence of the day. And as one activity is completed, you remove the picture, put it in the pouch so that they know whatever's on top is the next thing to come. Or sometimes they use a check mark system where it has like a wipe off board, so you check off as the activity is done. That can be really helpful. I think one of the most critical skills that we need to teach our kids that have hearing loss or auditory processing disorders is to paraphrase back important information. If I say, okay, you guys need to open your math book when you get home and do the even numbered problem on page 10, then I'm going to come up and I'm going to say, Bria, what are you supposed to do for homework? And if you don't tell me the even numbered problems on page 10 in my math book, then I'm going to correct and make sure. And I'm going to say, you know what, why don't you write this down in your planner so that you'll have that. It gives you an opportunity to make sure and to double check that they actually got it. You can check comprehension. And it may not be just a homework assignment. Maybe, I gave a definition of what's the definition, a simple definition of auditory processing disorder. Anyone? That's what the brain does with what the ear hears. Okay, if you can tell me that, I know you got it, and you're retaining it. If you don't, then I can say, oh, you know what, I think you need to go over that. Maybe you need to write that down. So that having them paraphrase back directions or critical information is integral. Another thing that I feel is, and we're going to talk more about it, is using the SQ3R method. I've talked about this in other classes, but it's a study strategy, it's a reading and study strategy that is, I think, a no-brainer. Once you see it, try it 1 or 2 times and you'll never not use it when you're studying. It'll be great for when you go to grad school. Obviously, using their assistive devices is a good way of compensating. Allow them to use earplugs if they need to, if they're highly distractible. Again, which type of person may need that? Which type of disorder is highly distractible? Integration disorder again. They may need that in particular. And then flexible preferential seating. What do I mean by flexible preferential seating? Okay, yes.
They don't do like assigned seating and stuff.
Exactly. So if I know that I, as the teacher, I'm going to be spending most of my time over here and up here, I want my kids that have learning and listening problems up front and to the side. I don't want them sitting back where Melanie is. Melanie, raise your hand so people who don't know you. Right. Don't want them back there. Don't want them where Olivia and Ashley are sitting at all. No. If I'm going to be moving around a lot, then I at least want them here in the front so that they've got the best chance. I don't want them sitting way in the back corners. Unless what? If I have sound field FM, or if I have them with personal FM, then it doesn't really matter. I could be sitting out in the hall on one of those benches, and it wouldn't matter. So, curriculum modification, how we present the information, compensatory strategies. Those are the 2 biggies. The SQ3R method. The S stands for surveys, where you have them look over the material and start taking some notes. You have them pay attention to the headings, the section headers, anything that's in bold print, maybe any charts or visuals in there. And the idea is to look at that stuff and start formulating questions. So, let's say it's a history lesson and it's about the Revolutionary War. And at the top of the page, there's a picture of crossing of the Delaware River. And there's a little caption under it. Well, then maybe what you write down, why was that an important event? Why was the crossing of the Delaware River important? And then maybe, talks about, another heading is taxation without representation. Okay, what does that mean? Write that down. What does taxation without representation mean? So you're starting to develop study questions. You can do that further by turning those headings into questions. Then you read to find the answer to your questions. Guess what? You don't have to read every single word in your textbooks. If you do this, you're going to find the relevant information. Guess what? It cuts your reading time by at least 50 to 75%. Then you're going to write or review your answers to your questions and then go over them and see if you can answer them without looking. And the ones that you can't, you know what you need to study over. It sounds cheesy, but I regret that I did not learn this technique as a kid who had a brain injury and who has today still some processing issues. But I didn't get this until my second semester of my junior year in high school. And I went to a college prep school that's notorious for not being the easiest school around. And I wish that I had learned this much earlier because it really would have helped me have to work a lot less than I did, or at least work a lot more efficiently than I did. So I think it's a great strategy. I encourage everybody to use it, but particularly, and you can Google some places, they'll change the words for the 3 R's, but the bottom line is they're all basically saying if you Google SQ3R, there's some great information about it out there. Another thing that we can do is a remediation technique. So we're talking about remediation. There are some listening programs out there that work on listening skills. LACE is one of my favorite. It is designed for adults, though. Maybe sophisticated adolescents, but particularly for adults. It is an evidence-based program. There is actual research to support its use. It actually does what it says it does. It has resulted in up to a 40% improvement in understanding discrimination and comprehension. So, and what's really cool is it's CD-ROM based, DVD based, or it can be done online. So, and what I like is with the CD-ROM and the online version, I give the patient a code, and then I can track their progress. I can actually go in and check on each person, and it allows me to say, hey, Mr. Jones, I notice you haven't done LACE in 3 weeks. Are you okay? Is everything all right? Are you struggling? So I can give them a little kick in behind to get them going. The DVD version, I don't have that luxury. We haven't arrived at Big Brother where I can track the viewing, TV viewing habits of my patients, but I can if they're doing it via computer. But it looks at their ability to understand in noise, with fast rate, with competing voices, so like restaurant, and it also has activities to improve auditory memory. Fantastic. Love it, love it, love it. Another, and there's nice evidence-based, I won't belabor it because we need to get out of here soon. Aerobics is designed for kids. There's clinic and home versions available. Step 1 is for the preschool and early elementary grades. Step 2 is designed for the older elementary grades, and then there is for junior high even, and then there's an adolescent and adult version. It works on auditory figure ground, sound blending, sound discrimination, rhyming, and auditory memory. Love, 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 love this program. It is terrific for our folks with auditory processing problems, and it also tends to improve reading and spelling as well, because it's working on phonemic and phonological awareness skills as well. Okay? There are listening therapies like the listening program, therapeutic listening, the Tomatoes program, ASHA considers them to still be quote-unquote experimental. Most of the evidence, and there's not a whole lot out there one way or the other, tends to be anecdotal or individual case studies, which when we later, Thursday, talk about evidence-based practices in our recap, you will know that individual case studies, single subject designs are legitimate but are among the weakest form of evidence. And so right now ASHA's stance is that there's not enough evidence-based research to advocate the widespread use of some of these listening programs. I can tell you I was trained to do the listening program, and I can tell you I've seen it really work for some kids. I've seen it have absolutely no impact on others. I haven't used it for a while just because of my practice setting, but I had gotten to the point where I had really refined who I was recommending it for, and I did feel like I was getting better at selecting the appropriate kids for it and seeing some actual results, or adults. I had a couple of adults. But just be aware that ASHA is not a real strong advocate. They haven't come out and said that it's unethical to do it, particularly if you're trying to collect data, which is what I was doing. But just know that they're not real big advocates of listening therapies at this point, just because of the lack of evidence. Questions about auditory processing and how we intervene? Yes, that's fine. Oh, and I have your graded exams. So if you would like your
I think so, yeah.
And those are your feedback Or do you want to do Thursday? Yeah. I have no idea. I haven't read them on my computer.